Okay, thank you so much to everybody that's joining us. Congressman, we are live.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Welcome everybody to the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University's conversation with Congressman John Sarbanes on HR 1, the For the People Act. Now, we're going to have to improvise a little bit tonight. We're going to have to be flexible. We're a few minutes late getting into this conversation because the congressman was voting on the floor and he's going to be called back to the floor in about 7:35. So agility is we put a value on that. And so Congressman Sarbanes is going to take his phone with him when he goes to vote to continue our conversation. And given the time constraints we have, I want to get right into the conversation. Just one bit of housekeeping. Please join us on March 18th. Very special guest, President Bill Clinton will be helping us launch our new Campaign for the Future of Democracy, an initiative that seeks to build resilience against attempts to undermine the norms of democracy and democracy itself. It's President Clinton on March 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern. You can get information about that and register just by Googling Cornell Institute of Politics or going to iopga.cornell.edu. Tonight, a conversation with Congressman John Sarbanes on a landmark democracy bill that he introduced in the House on January 4th, but he has been fighting for this bill since he came to Capitol Hill. I do not recall, John, a conversation with you about anything that did not involve your pushing hard and fighting for passage of HR 1. Just so you know, we're joined by several of your and my former colleagues tonight. We're joined by former Congressman John Barrow, former Congressman Bill Enyart, former Congressman Rush Holt, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, and a member of the New York State Board of Regents, Roger Tillis. John, let me just introduce you properly. For those of you who don't know, the congressman was elected from Maryland in 2007. He serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, also the House Oversight and Reform Committee. Since 2017, he's chaired the Democracy Reform Task Force. I urge you to go to their website. They have a wonderful section-by-section summation of HR 1 that I commend to your attention. John and I served together for 4 terms, and again, no voice was more tenacious, was stronger, had greater clarity on the issue of voting rights, campaign finance reform, and ethics than Congressman John Sarbanes was. John, thank you again for joining with us. Let's begin with the bill itself, John. This is the first non-COVID related legislation that was passed by the House of Representatives. You've been working at it for so many years. Give us a thumbnail sketch of the legislation.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. First of all, I appreciate the invitation. It's great to be with you and with some of my former colleagues that I served with, and then others who I didn't get the privilege of serving with. But this has always been a team effort bringing these reforms forward, and we're just so pleased that we've reached a milestone with passage of HR 1 in the House. We'll talk later, I'm sure, about what the path looks like going forward. But to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch of what is in this large, comprehensive, in a sense, omnibus reform bill, it was built very much in response to grievances we were hearing from Americans across the country who look at their democracy and politics, often feel left out, locked out, and a cynicism has been setting in over a period of years. And so we were trying to listen very carefully to that. Members of our caucus over a period of years have been drafting legislation designed to meet those grievances and respond to them. So they kind of fall into a number of different baskets. That's probably the best way to give the overview of HR 1. For starters, people have been saying to us for a long time, we're tired of having to run an obstacle course every 2 years to get to the ballot box. Doesn't make any sense. Here we are, 50 years after John Lewis shed blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marching for voting rights. And we're still nowhere near a gold standard when you compare us to our peer nations in terms of accessing the ballot box. So there's a whole set of reforms. And by the way, they're largely what John Lewis wrote in his Voter Empowerment Act. The first 300 pages of HR 1, Title 1, is John Lewis's bill that he introduced 5 Congresses in a row. Things like automatic voter registration, online voter registration, same-day registration, no excuse absentee ballot voting, a minimum number of days of early voting across the country, et cetera. Things that just make the franchise work for people across the country. And by the way, we saw people use all these modalities in 2020. They had to overcome a lot of obstacles to do it, but they fought their way to the ballot box. It shouldn't be a fight. There shouldn't be obstacles. That's why we're trying to make these improvements in HR 1. Another thing we heard from people is we're tired of this idea that politicians pick their voters instead of the other way around. That's a shorthand way of criticizing partisan gerrymandering. So included in the bill is a requirement that every state in the country establish independent redistricting commissions to draw congressional district lines. And this is the moment to have a provision like that because we're about to do the redistricting for the next 10 years in this election cycle. So very important reform. So that's included. Third thing we heard is protect our election infrastructure and protect it in particular from foreign interference. People have been made very anxious over the last few years when they look at what foreign actors are trying to do to get into our democracy and cause mischief. So we've got a whole set of provisions that would strengthen and make our election infrastructure more resilient. They also said to us, when you get to Washington, whether you're a lawmaker in the legislative branch or you serve in the executive branch, you should behave yourselves. You should act ethically and transparently and with accountability. So we've got a set of reforms there. And then the last basket, Steve, and you and I talked at length about this when you were here, and since you've graduated from Congress, it's the influence of big money on the system. The sense the people have that their politics and the policymaking apparatus in Washington has been sort of corroded and corrupted by the influence that money has and special interests have. And that's where this sense of feeling kind of left out of the conversation comes from. This notion that insiders are calling the shots and the average person just can't compete. Their voice can't measure up to the big money voice. So we have a whole set of reforms, including transparency and disclosure of where this secret money is coming from. So we kind of pull it out of the shadows, making the Federal Election Commission work again. So it can be the cop on the beat that blows the whistle when the big money actors are crossing the line. And then setting up a small donor matching system, very much modeled on systems like what New York City has, where a candidate can choose to collect small donations, earn matching funds, and power their campaign that way. So they don't have to go hat in hand to these existing sources of funding, like the PACs, like the big donors, like the lobbyists. They can turn to the people and be dependent on the people alone, as James Madison used to say. And as I close, I'll just mention that this particular system, we fund not with taxpayer money, but with a small, less than 5% surcharge that would be placed on government settlements with sort of large corporate lawbreakers, high-end tax cheats. In that way, the people who've broken the trust of the public are being asked to kind of underwrite a system that can begin to restore the trust of the public. So those are the contents. There's a lot of other stuff in there, but that's the essence of HR 1 and what has now become S1 designated on the Senate side. We were able to get the bill passed last week. We're excited about that. We obviously have many miles to go before we sleep. We do know this, according to the polls, a majority of Republicans, independents, and Democrats support these changes. For them, it's not controversial. Unfortunately, here in Washington, it's been made partisan because the Republicans so far have leaned against it. But out in the country, these are things that people of all political stripes want to see. And that's our North Star. That's how we design this legislation, and that's why we're going to push it forward. Steve, thanks for your interest over all these years. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you again for joining us. John, passed in the House by a party line vote, over in the Senate now. Who sponsored it in the Senate?
So Jeff Merkley is the Senate sponsor. A lot of the work in terms of hearings and markups will occur in Senator Klobuchar's committee, the Rules Committee on the Senate side. And that process, I think, is going to begin the week of September, or rather March 24th. She's going to have a hearing, and then we'll proceed from there.
John, I'm going to ask you another question, but again, we're going to be agile. Natalie is our director, and I'm going to ask her to contact some of the students who have proposed some questions and get them up front, just in case you do have to leave for votes. I want to make sure that Cornell students, faculty, alumni have an opportunity to ask you some questions. Let's back up a little bit. I had mentioned, Congressman, that you have had a single-minded determination on this bill. I remember in leadership meetings, no matter what subject we were talking about, you brought it to democracy reform, campaign finance. Why this issue, John? Why have you been so focused on this one issue?
That's a great question, Steve. And what happens when I got here 15 years ago, there were certain things I wanted to work on, I wanted to make progress on as a policy matter. But I started to perceive pretty quickly that progress on those things was being blocked by the influence that money was having on the system, whether it was, Wall Street getting in the way of fair tax policy, or the fossil fuel industry holding up action on climate change, or the gun lobby blocking sensible gun safety legislation, the big pharma shutting down our efforts to lower prescription drugs. Everywhere you turn to try to do something right on public policy, and again, things that I think broad majorities of the American people support, you ran into this problem of the influence of special interests and money. So I stepped back and I started really digging into the problem and thought, well, how can we start structurally to change the system to remove these obstacles and create a policymaking apparatus that can actually process the will of the people instead of getting blocked at every turn. I like to say that this issue of money in politics, in a sense, caffeinates every other issue that you might think of. Or another way to put it, it's the gateway issue. If you can solve the problem of the rules being kind of, rigged against the average person in terms of our democracy, then you can go get all these other things done. So that is very much the motivation here. And, it's a pretty powerful argument to the man on the street and the woman on the street, because they get it. They've woken up in the last few years to what the problem is. And like I said, there's no controversy about these reforms. The only controversy, Steve, is that it's taking us so long to get them done. So I'm hoping that we can get it done in this moment, when, by the way, we see at the state level that Republican lawmakers in the first 6 weeks of this year have introduced 250 pieces of legislation to roll back voting in America. They're stampeding in the wrong direction. We want to move in a positive direction and fix our democracy.
Natalie, I think we have Dana Karami first up.
Yes, Dana, if you could unmute and turn on your video. Dana is a sophomore in the College of Human Ecology and also VP of Operations at Cornell Votes.
And Dana, where are you from?
I'm from Aurora, Colorado.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and meet Congressman Sarbanes.
Of course. Hi, Congressman. Great to see you. My question for you is sort of beyond HR 1. HR 1 is certainly bold and necessary, but in order to make voting truly accessible in the long term, there will definitely need to be continued action on this front. And as an active organizer of Cornell Votes, I've just been so aware of the smaller inconveniences that prevent people, particularly young people, from being able to vote. So my question for you is, how can we take the momentum of HR 1 and continue to lower institutional and non-institutional barriers to voting so we can have increased turnout for everyone?
Great question. And whatever kind of voter you are, by whatever kind of demographic or age group or so forth, the goal here in HR 1 was to clear that path to the ballot box and make it easier. I think for young people, the availability of automatic voter registration, but also same-day registration is going to make a huge difference, because automatic voter registration happens when you sort of have contact with government agencies. Sometimes, young people haven't had that contact, so they might not be able to access registration as easily that way. But with same-day registration, you can show up on election day or at an early voting site, and you can register right then and there and be able to cast your vote. And we've seen actually in states where they have same-day registration that it has benefited young people in particular. That's a real resource for them. So the other thing is that we allow under HR 1 the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. So this whole process of kind of delivering registration opportunity to the public recognizes that we ought to be getting young people ready for that opportunity when they turn 18 to vote. There's no reason why we can't register them earlier in the process. So that was definitely included as well. But to your initial point, we don't pretend that these reforms are going to end the process of opening up our democracy. We view them as something critical at this moment to make sure we shore up and strengthen the democracy. And yes, broaden access, but we think they'll lead to other good ideas, good reforms. We'll be able to study the results of these reforms and continue to make changes and adjustments so that we're always looking at best practices as we go forward. And that when it comes to voting, we can achieve that gold standard, which ought to be the hallmark of American democracy, but sadly has not been for so long. So that's the goal here. And I think we can make a quantum leap if we can get HR 1 passed.
Dana, thank you very much. Natalie, before we go to the next student, there's a question that came in from a fellow Marylander of the Congressman Sarbanes. His name is Nielsen. He says, as a fellow Marylander, I'm sure Representative Sarbanes recognizes how much our congressional districts are gerrymandered. In the case by the state legislature in Maryland with a Democratic Party majority, what would fair redistricting look like in Maryland?
Well, great question. I mean, fair redistricting across the country, just to start there, means that the process is independent, objective. There's certain criteria that govern it according to certain, standards that you would want to meet. But it would basically mean that the politics would be pulled away from how redistricting gets done. Now, in a state like Maryland, it's a little tricky to come up with sort of rectangular districts in Maryland, because Maryland's got a very strange shape to start with, and then you got the Chesapeake Bay kind of going all through it. But I think you could have more compact districts if this was done through an independent commission process. And that would certainly be the case elsewhere in the country. One of the tensions we've had, Steve, in this process is there are some states across the country, as you know, that have put these commissions in place. And that sort of begged the question, why isn't everyone doing it? Well, some states have resisted it. And the thing is, if you don't do it in every place, which is what we want to do with HR 1, you create a system where the politics of it in the places where it's not being done by commission get even more intense. So that further distorts kind of how members are elected and come to Congress. So we want to make sure this is a broad solution. And that was the design in bringing it into HR 1. Again, it's another thing that people have been working on for many, many years. I think John Barrow worked on this at one point along the way. By the way, John, if you're on this call, thank you for always wishing me a happy birthday on my birthday. But others have really leaned in on this question. We're now at a point where we can get it done, but only if we can get this package. And the whole package, I just want to make this point, of HR 1 is really critical, because the public is smart enough to know that if you fix some things like voting, but you don't fix other things like gerrymandering or the influence of big money, you're not solving their problem. They want back in a real and a sustainable way. And they've told us, you got to do the whole package, or we're not going to be confident that we're actually getting our democracy back.
On redistricting, let me quantify this for a moment. When I was elected to Congress in 2000, there were about 125 to 135 truly competitive districts. Could be represented by a Republican or a Democrat, which meant that the incumbent had to compromise. When I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, I had about 75 competitive districts to work with. All the other districts had been drawn to protect somebody on the left or the right, an incumbent. And today, John, I'm sure you know this, there are 16 districts in the United States Congress represented by an incumbent of one party that voted for a presidential candidate of the other party. So we're down to 16 crossover districts, which is outlandish.
Yeah.
Let's take the next student, please.
Great. So our next student will be Patrick. Patrick is also a sophomore in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. He is the president of Cornell Votes. And just so our audience is aware, Cornell Votes is a nationally recognized nonpartisan student-led initiative aiming to increase voter registration, turnout, and civic engagement. Patrick, go ahead and ask your question.
Patrick, where are you from?
I'm from Yonkers, New York, just outside the Bronx. So, Congressman, thank you so much for coming to speak. We sincerely appreciate it. And with Cornell Votes, we do a lot of interaction with college students who are balancing where they want to register to vote. So students come to Cornell and they decide, where does my vote matter, both electorally and federal elections, but they also care a lot about, is my impact more strong in Tompkins County at the New York State level or whatever state they're from. So my question for you is, how do you expect the automatic voter registration portions and the same day voter registration portions of HR 1 to impact college students who are balancing this question of where to register to vote and then ultimately where to vote?
Yeah. Well, I still think that the choice, the judgment about where to be registered is going to be up to the individual student based on balancing all of those things that you just mentioned. But the process of being able to achieve that will just be a lot easier if you have these options available to you. And so, and really that's at the heart of what we're trying to do. If you make the system structurally one that facilitates registration and voting and so forth, then against that backdrop or on that foundation, citizens can make the kind of judgments that you just alluded to a lot more easily. And frankly, sort of ahead of time, not getting into this crunch position that so many people find themselves in. And that's the kind of aspiration of this, is if we could get to where the basic mechanisms for this opportunity work, then we can put a lot more energy into kind of building onto that and promoting civic engagement and voter engagement, instead of having to spend every 2 years compensating with all our energy and work and focus for things that are broken in the democracy, whether it's voting or money or whatever it might be. It's crazy that we're still in this position, as I say. A professor from Duke who testified in the House Administration Committee a couple of weeks ago on the importance of HR 1 said, what HR 1 does in many respects in terms of voting is it shifts the burden of making voting accessible and easy for Americans from the individual citizen onto the government, and says, look, if this is going to be a priority in our country, which we all believe it is, then the government needs to step up and try to facilitate this. So when you get up on the day you want to vote, whether it's going to be by filling in an oval on your mail-in ballot, or going to an early voting site, or going on election day to your polling place, you can do that, and it's not going to be an ordeal. You don't have to make a contingency plan about something going wrong. But too many Americans get up on that day and they feel like they're having to push through a storm in order to get their voice heard. That's what we're trying to fix here. We'll definitely be able to do that for the benefit of students who at this moment in our history, I'm glad to say, are really stepping up and leaning in on issues they care about. So thank you for your leadership.
John, I heard the bells ring. I got a little bit of post-traumatic stress when I heard those buzzers. I flinched. You need to get to the floor now, or what's?
Let me keep going. I'll just keep an eye on the situation.
All right, very good. Natalie, do we have another question?
Yes, let me remind the audience, if they want to ask a question, they can type it in at the bottom. They can raise their hands if they'd like to ask by phone. So it looks like we have a question from Gabe. Gabe, if you can unmute, please, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, Congressman. Thank you very much for being here. I hope you'll forgive the skepticism of a layperson when it comes to the bill's chances of passage through the Senate. But can you talk, I know you're not a member of the Senate, but can you talk a little bit about, since Senator Merkley is not here, the strategy for actually getting this thing into law?
Yeah, I'm glad to. Well, for starters, the first part of the strategy was put as much power and force behind it coming out of the House as we could. We think we've done that. We've done that now 2 Congresses in a row, by the way. So we feel very good about that. The second is to just kind of turn the temperature up. We think out in the country, the demand for this, the appetite for this reform is very strong. And there's starting to be organic uptake around HR1, S1, because in part because of what we see the other side doing. People are like, oh my God, what are we going to do about this? They're trying to shut down voting. And it's like, hey, by the way, we've been working on this bill for years. It can actually do a lot to make sure that we keep our democracy intact and strengthen it. So the public understanding of this opportunity is going up every single day. That's going to help. The second thing that's going to help is, and increasingly you're hearing this articulated, if there's one place where a supermajority requirement should not be used to thwart legislation, it's with respect to legislation that's trying to restore majority rule in America. Like on that kind of thing, on basic rule setting for the democracy, it should be a simple up or down vote. There shouldn't be a 60 vote threshold imposed. This is an argument that Amy Klobuchar, who's going to have this bill in her committee in the coming weeks, has begun to articulate. And others, you're getting a lot of attention to this idea of, let's call it a democracy exception or exemption from the filibuster rule. That's being talked about more and more every day. I think it's a powerful argument because what's more important than our democracy? We've made exceptions to the filibuster for budgeting purposes. That's what the budget reconciliation process is. When it comes to setting these basic rules on people's voice and how it matters in their democracy, like I said, that should be a simple majority vote. So that's getting attention. And then there's a kind of cosmic epic narrative dimension of this, which is the following. The United States Senate was delivered to Democrats by 2 runoff elections on the same day in the same state. That was a lightning strike, basically. No one would have predicted it. That state was Georgia. Georgia's the state that John Lewis represented in the United States Congress for years. John Lewis wrote the first 300 pages of HR1. Are we really not going to go cement the legacy of John Lewis coming off of the Georgia lightning strike, the November election, and then the January 5th runoffs, because of a self-imposed 60 vote threshold? I mean, it's unfathomable to me. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I don't pretend to be an expert on the mysteries of the Senate procedures, and I don't really want to be an expert on that. But I think that if there is the will, and it's clear when you talk to people in the country and increasingly lawmakers on the Hill, there is a will to get this done, particularly when we look at the plus minus on not doing it. If there is the will, there has to be a way. And I think we will ultimately get this over the finish line in Congress and on to President Biden's desk so that he can sign it into law.
John, I may have been out of Congress for several years, but I still know how to make a good deal. You should go vote. Before you do, however, and it's going to be tough to keep you on the phone. Let's do this. Would you agree if we let you go vote and end early, would you agree to come back? We actually have Senator Merkley coming on with us in April. Would you agree to come on with Senator Merkley if the schedule permits so we can continue this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to do it. And I think I can go for a while. I might,
really?
The safe thing might be for me to end a little early, but for now I can keep going because, you know, they're keeping these votes open longer because of COVID. We vote in groups. So I'm still down the line a little bit. So I'm going to get I might be consulting my my device here from my staff to know when I have to panic. But for now, I'm okay. So let's keep going.
You tell us when you need to leave,
All
and
right.
we'll end early and have you come back. Now, the
Okay.
next question.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions in the chat that are asking for the congressman's opinion on mandatory voting and also making Election Day a national holiday. If he has any comments on either.
Well, there was an amendment to make Election Day a national holiday, and that was included in the manager's amendment in the bill. So that actually is part of what we passed the other day as HR 1. We'll see if the Senate companion has that. I will say that the pressure for Election Day to be a holiday is a little less when you put things in place like 15 days of early voting, which we require across the country, because that obviously makes, that opens people's opportunity up, and mail-in voting and so forth. So when everything was happening on Election Day, there's a lot of pressure to make that a holiday so that everyone could access the vote easily. With these other opportunities in place, a little less pressure, but nevertheless, something that I think people are interested in, and it was included in HR 1. In terms of mandatory voting, I mean, my view is let's do what we can to make it a lot easier for people to register and vote in America on a voluntary basis instead of throwing all these obstacles up at them, and see how we do. The fact of the matter is, you look in states that have put in place mail-in voting for a long period of time, good early voting opportunities, automatic voter registration, and the participation rates by voters are significantly higher in those places. It makes sense. If you make it easier for people to vote in America, they might go vote. And so my view is, let's test that proposition first before we go to kind of the concept of mandatory voting.
John, what can people who are viewing you right now, what could they do to support this legislation if they're so disposed?
So there's a terrific coalition that's been formed called the Declaration for American Democracy. This is a coalition made up of over 150 groups across the country who came together based on what we were talking about a little while back, the notion that the influence of money, the problems around voting and so forth, were blocking progress on all the key issues we care about. So this is a coalition made up of environmental groups, labor groups, good government groups, faith groups, consumer protection groups, et cetera, who all got together and locked arms and said, in order for progress on our issues to happen, we got to reset the rules of the democracy, and they are supporting the HR 1 S1 effort. So you can go to the Declaration for American Democracy website. They have a portal there on how people can get involved, and I would certainly ask everybody on the call to do that and just add your voice. And to the extent you feel like you've downloaded enough information here about what is an HR 1 and S1, please share that, because the more people understand what is in this reform package, the more excited they get, the more determined they are to see it happen. And we are at that inflection point where we need to get as many people stepping behind us at this crucial moment as we possibly can.
And we've posted the link for that, and we encourage people to check it out. John, several questions about the influence of social media, misinformation, disinformation, your views on that.
Yeah, so we also have provisions in the bill that would create much more transparency in how these digital ad platforms are carrying advertising, political advertising. You know, in broadcast advertising, as you know, Steve, you have to kind of stand behind your commercials. There has to be attribution. That's where we say, you know, I'm John Sarbanes or Steve Israel, and I approve this message. There's nothing like that really in the digital space right now. And that allows, again, shadowy actors to kind of behind the scenes pull the strings in ways that disrespects the public and can lead to a lot of disinformation. So we've got provisions that would really tighten that up and require people to kind of stand by their ad, regardless of how that ad gets delivered. We also know that foreign actors have sought to sow disinformation kind of get into our democracy through the nooks and crannies. So there's a number of provisions that can shine a light there, track the money that could be coming from foreign sources so we can crack down on that. So there are ways to do this. Again, if there's the will, there's the way. And we built that into HR1. So that's a very critical part of the reforms for sure.
Natalie, next question, please.
So we have a lot of questions in the chat today asking if the congressman can help educate the audience on the division between federal and state rights here. A lot of them are talking about, how states have rules with voting, and how is it that this can sort of be in line with those rules, or will this supersede those rules?
Great question, because this is a big debate happening, because critics of this bill want to allege that this is a federal takeover of elections at the state level. It's not a federal takeover. Congress has authority to put these best practices in place when it comes to voting in federal elections. The time, place, and manner clause of the United States Constitution gives us that authority, and there's no jurisprudence of the Supreme Court that argues with that point. So we can set best practices and standards and norms for how elections operate across the country. Federal elections. Now, the practical dimension of this is that any state that's required to put all these changes in place for federal elections is going to do that for state elections, because it's not going to make any sense from a cost standpoint or efficiency standpoint for them to stand up two completely different systems of voting, one for the state and one for the federal. So in a sense, we can leverage these standards broadly across the country using authority that Congress absolutely has with respect to federal elections. Same thing applies with respect to partisan gerrymandering, et cetera. So we feel pretty good that constitutionally, we are on very solid ground. And I say that with respect to the whole bill, because we certainly expect there to be challenges, legal challenges to this. So we've designed it and anchored it in the jurisprudence in a way that we think will be able to rebut those arguments and those challenges going forward.
John Derek Liebertz asked a very good question. He writes, in an effort to move things forward together, it's important to understand the motivations of the other side. When so many Republicans in the states agree with this, what is the motivation for Republican members of Congress not to agree with it? So what are you hearing from your colleagues?
I wish there was a good answer to that question. Sadly, I think here's what's happened. I think that a lot of the elected officials in the Republican Party over the last few years have gotten comfortable with a playbook where you win not based on your ideas, you win based on, in a sense, manipulating the size and makeup of the political town square through voter suppression, through partisan gerrymandering, through using big money to spread disinformation and block good public policy. They've just gotten conditioned to that. And I think that's the wrong impulse, because I actually think that if Republicans kind of retrenched and thought about, well, what ideas can come from our side of the ideological spectrum that we think the public would respond to, they could actually go put out some pretty good proposals. But that's not what they've done over the last few years. They've kind of gotten used to this other playbook, and it's become kind of a reflex to reach for that. That's what you're seeing happen out there in the country right now. They're looking at the November election, where they got more votes on the Republican side than any presidential candidate in history, except for Joe Biden, who got 6 million more. And so their calculation is not how do we win the hearts and minds of the public, but how do we make sure that the other side doesn't get that many votes going forward? And so you're seeing this play out. I think it's a mistake. And I actually think that if we can get HR1 reforms in place for the long-term benefit of the Republican Party, that's what you would see. In other words, it benefits parties that act responsibly. It benefits candidates who go try to sell their ideas in a responsible and effective way, which is exactly what you would want the reward system to be in a democracy. not one that's based on sort of shutting down the voices of average people out there. So I would say rank and file Republicans and conservatives understand the future of their own party better than a lot of leadership in Washington right now, because the polling, as I say, shows that a majority of Republicans favor the reforms that we've put into H.R. 1.
And of course, this bill levels the playing field for everybody. Republicans and Democrats enjoy a gerrymandering advantage depending on who controls the state legislature. Republicans and Democrats have super PACs. Republicans and Democrats
That's right.
We
all need to play by the same rules.
That's exactly right.
In my floor statement the other day, I was thanking Republican voters who in the last election used automatic voter registration, used same-day registration where it was available, used early voting where it was available, used mail-in voting by the millions where it was available. So again, there's no controversy on these things. It's just about whether we can get these reforms done so we have a level playing field across the country. I don't want a country, Steve, where there's some states where you can vote easily and conveniently. And then on the other side of the fence, there's states where people are being blocked in terms of their access to the ballot box. That would be two separate Americas, and it would continue to divide our democracy. We can do better than that. We can use these reforms actually to help unify the country going forward.
You're still good on time?
Yeah, I think I can go for another 5 or 6 minutes or so.
And you are really dedicated to this issue, because I know how fast you're going to have to run from that desk to the floor and back. You'll be breathless when you take that vote, but thank you so much for sticking with us.
Got my mask here. I'm ready to go.
All right. Natalie, next questions, please.
Great. So we have quite a few people that are asking if you have any idea when this bill will be voted on in the Senate, and then following that, have there been any considerations given to, if it gets passed in the Senate, what will need to be tweaked to get it across the finish line? What are you looking for in a finalized bill?
Right. So timing wise, I think sooner rather than later. I think there's an imperative to keep this thing moving, because the experts, frankly, have told us that if we can get this legislation passed sort of in the early months of this year, that'll give us time to implement a lot of these things for the 2022 election. And it would be wonderful to be able to go to the American people the first election after they kind of fought their way to the polls in November and say, we heard you, we've been listening, and we've created some better access for your democracy. Here it is. What a gift that would be. And it would begin to restore people's faith and confidence. So we want to get this done sooner rather than later. In terms of changes to the bill, I got to tell you, this thing is very tight as it is. It's a big bill, but all these reforms are interlocking. And as I said, we did that because the public told us to do that. They want to see all these things because they understand that if you don't have some of them, then they're still not fully part of their democracy. So we're holding on to this package as tightly and as for long as we possibly can. It doesn't mean, as Steve knows and my other colleagues on the call, that as you get to sort of the 11th hour, you're not making changes and adjustments, certainly when the Senate and the House are in conference, if we get to that point. But the basic, what I call load-bearing walls inside the architecture of H.R. 1, S1 need to stay there, because if you start pulling any of those out, the bill will begin to collapse on itself because it won't meet the expectation of the public. And frankly, it won't meet the careful kind of equities inside of the caucus that we have across the Capitol that it does now. So we're going to hold this thing together for the American people for as long as we can.
Let's take one final question, Natalie.
Okay.
Great. Nancy has had her hand up for a little bit. Nancy, if you could unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Nancy, you with us? All right. Sounds like Nancy cannot unmute. Well, Congressman Sarbanes, we do know you have to vote. Can't thank you enough. We hope that you will consider coming on with Senator Merkley when we have him. We're working out the date right now. I think it would be instructive to us. And on behalf of everybody at Cornell, we thank you for your leadership, for sticking with this bill for so long. And we look forward to hearing more from you. And with that, I'm going to make one
Thanks.
announcement, but I'm not going to hold you up. You go.
Thanks,
vote.
Steve. I appreciate it.
Thank
You know, they say that 90% of success in life is just showing up. So I've made myself into a pest on this issue for 15 years. We managed to get it to land right in the House. We're going to keep fighting to get it over the finish line in the Senate. And as I say, on to President Biden's desk, the stakes could not be higher at this moment. You know, this is not a situation where we can do this now or do this later. I very much view it as a situation where if we don't do this now, we may never get the chance again. And so we have to meet this moment. I think the public is ready for it. We don't want to disappoint them. Shame on us if we do. So we're going to keep pushing as hard as we can. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for their interest and your support as we move forward with this.
John Sarbanes, thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
We know that the congressman has to go vote. Let me let folks know again that President Clinton will be joining us on March 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern for a conversation on the state of democracy. This will launch the new Campaign for the Future of Democracy, a bipartisan initiative that seeks to strengthen American resilience against those who would undermine democratic norms and democracy itself. We hope that you'll join us on March 18th for President Clinton. And with that, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, and be safe, everybody. So long.